My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here at the Center for Fiction. Are any of you joining us for the first time this evening? Oh, amazing. Well, you're very welcome here. The Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit, and our mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and to support and celebrate its creation and enjoyment. We do this through public events and partnerships like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, robust membership offerings, all vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. Let's see, visit our site, please, and sign up for our mailing list so you don't miss anything. For example, something else fun that's coming up on Tuesday, March 11th, we're hosting Leila Leilami to talk about her new novel, The Dream Hotel with Ruman Alam. Before I bring on our partner, the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival, one quick bit of housekeeping. We will have an audience Q&A tonight, and if you're here in the room, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. And that's so the folks who are watching online can hear you. And if you're watching online, you can type your question in the chat and we will read it out for you. It is now my absolute pleasure to introduce you to another Melanie Painter, one of the founders of our presenting partner, the Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Good evening for what we've dubbed the Caribbean Takeover here at the CFF this month. In 2021, Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, eloquently addressed the challenges of overcoming self-doubt as individuals from small islands. She highlighted the pervasive feeling of being lesser due to our geographical origins, which often hinders our ability to celebrate our achievements. However, she reminded us that our upbringing teaches us that in many ways we are exceptional. Small islands have produced world-renowned talents like Jamaican musician Robert Nesta Marley and literary figures such as Trinidadian Earl Lovelace, Antiguan Jamaica Kincaid, Jamaican Marlon James, and Guadeloupean Maurice Condé. As Caribbean people, we have always excelled in storytelling, using writing and poetry to articulate our emotions, experiences, and joy. I grew up immersed in the works of V.S. Naipaul, Eric Williams, Earl Lovelace, and Michael Anthony, authors whose contributions deserve monumental recognition. Without their pioneering voices, we wouldn't be here today celebrating writers like Diana McCaulay, a Jamaican author whose work continues to thrive in Jamaica, and of course Maisy, whose work as librarian, author, and editor protects, edifies, and advances Caribbean writers in transplanted places. The Brooklyn Caribbean Literary Festival plays a crucial role in championing Caribbean writers across the diaspora. Today, we welcome Diana to the stage to celebrate the launch of A House of Miss Pauline, a story that is already bearing the fruit of generous praise for venerating the beauty and nation language, in the words of Kamal Braffett of rural Jamaica. Miss Pauline is a heroine raised from among the hordes of uncelebrated men and women who have made Jamaica the global icon of influence it is today. A House for Miss Pauline, like Maisy's These Ghosts Are Family, is a literary reminder that regardless of our background or the colonial legacies we bear, our stories are significant, and the voice in which they are told are of divine importance. They offer guidance, intrigue, and joy to our readers, and are truly deserving of celebration. The BCLF has embarked upon a remarkable journey, now in its 7th year, and we're not stopping anytime soon. Fun fact, Diana is the winner of the BCLF 2024 Award for Writers in the Caribbean, while Maisy has been instrumental in the Brooklyn Rail partnership that publishes those stories, and she also served as a guest judge for the diaspora arm of the fiction contest in 2022. Tonight is a confluence of all our efforts to create opportunities of visibility and to celebrate Caribbean writing within the world. If you're a writer, we invite you to visit our website and familiarize yourself with our work. In the coming weeks, we will be launching our Caribbean Writers Directory. We encourage you, if you're a writer, to join. If not, then tell a friend to tell a friend, because we aim to create the largest collection of Caribbean writers worldwide. This monumental movement welcomes all, whether you're from a small island or not. This evening is made more special as we mark the occasion of Diana's first US publication, within a decorated career of being published several times previously. Without further ado, I want to warmly welcome Diana and Maisy on stage.
Not sure if this is on. Can everybody hear me?
What about me?
Great. All right, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to the Center for Fiction and the Brooklyn Caribbean Lit Fest for having us. I think we're just gonna get started by having Diana read a short excerpt from her novel.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read right from the beginning of the book. And Miss Pauline, she uses some Jamaican bad words, so brace yourself, despite being 99. Or perhaps because she's 99. When Miss Pauline finally comes to understand that the stone walls of her house have begun to move, she knows she will die before her 100th birthday, just over a month away. She sleeps in her mother's iron bed under a light sheet, the mosquito net pulled close, and for the past 7 nights, she's been woken by unfamiliar noises. The first time it happened, she considered getting up to investigate, but the noise stopped. "Country night full of sound," she whispered aloud to reassure herself. She's not someone who has struggled to sleep at any point in her life, not after bereavements, not with newborns, not when her baby father went to build roads for months, or when her boy child came home with torn clothes and swollen eyes, not when her girl child became a mother and took up with a man she disliked, never with indecision or worry, sickness or remorse, not when her monthly stopped coming, not after the wounds of loss or disaster, not even when her dreams became the recurring nightmare of an underground cavern below an unreachable hole in the rock, arousing guilt that clung like mortar. Not when she began calling herself old at 80. But night after night, she's been roused, first by her body and then by the noises. Her stomach cramps, her fingers ache, she's thirsty. One night, a rustling, easily dismissed as small nocturnal animals outside, going about their business. The next, a swishing, like a storm through trees, but when she goes to the half-open sash window, the night is windless. On the third night, she hears the scrape of a heavy stone being pulled through pebbly mud, wet and grasping. The fifth and sixth nights are split by a cracking, like men breaking stone with hammers and pickaxes, men hauling stone, men quarrying. She shudders and fear feathers her skin. She pulls the sheet up, but it presses down on her body, and she thinks of a shroud. Her mouth fills with saliva and she swallows, reaches for the cup beside her bed, rivers cool water, and drinks. The noises are not only strange and too close, but they are directed at her, for her. "Come on, Pauline, what do you?" she demands out loud. "How much things make noise at nighttime? Rat, cat, croaking lizard, dog, bat, owl, mongoose in the chicken coop. Tap your ass, foolishness. In a safe place." But she well knows that dangers hide in safe places. If a man, a thief, is in her house, she be sorry, he be sorry. On the 7th night, she gets up and reaches for the lass stored under her bed, her knees crackling. She holds one of the bedposts and pulls herself up, thinks of her baby father, Clive, who gave her the cutlass and the leather scabbard made with his own hand. Her son, Alvin, insisted on installing electricity. She's never liked or trusted the wires that run along the walls of her house. Alvin had a banking job in Kingston and he used to pay her bill. She's often imagined complaints from his unpleasant town wife about the money he spent on her and what her son might have said in response. If she has light now, I don't feel so guilty for not visiting her in Mason Hall. Alvin, her firstborn, the handle of the lass is smooth against her palm, but heavier than it used to be. Is not heavier, girl. You is weaker. Out loud she says, weaker is not fucking weak. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. I love this book for so many reasons, and I felt like I related to it for so many reasons. And so while I was doing research, I had read the essay you wrote about the origins, of the novel, which I thought was really fascinating. So can you just kind of give us the background about how you started writing and what inspired you?
So my books tend to have really long gestations. So this one started, I did not know this at the time, but it started when I was attending a writer's workshop at a plantation great house in Jamaica. So I've been kind of fascinated by plantation great houses with equal measures of sort of recognition for their beauty. They're often in the most beautiful places you could imagine, and revulsion at the atrocities that took place there. So I'm at this writer's workshop, and I'm kind of a scholarship student, so they've given me this little tiny room under the front steps of the great house. Any Jamaican here will know which one I'm talking. And I started wondering who occupied this room. It was very small, and I wondered if it was maybe a place for tools, or if it was a woman who looked after the people who lived in the great house, and she needed to be there because she was close. And boy, she took up residence in my mind. I was 2003, so a long time ago. And then, roughly 10 years later, a little more than that, I got this out-of-the-blue phone call from a New Zealand television company saying that I was related to a celebrity chef in New Zealand. They were doing one of these TV programs, Who Do You Think You Are? And they were flying the man to Jamaica. He thought he was Italian, of Italian background, and he would learn while in the air that he was actually of Jamaican heritage, and would I be prepared to meet with him? Of course, I said yes. And sitting with this man who I was meeting for the first time at a place called Ligony Club in Kingston, which is ultra-colonial setting. I mean, I even think they asked us to sit on a swing. I was handed this history of, on my mother's side, of a Portuguese Sephardic Jew who had come to Jamaica to grow tobacco and was the ancestor that came to Jamaica and had about 9 children with an enslaved West African woman. And that was the first time I knew of this history on my mother's side. Growing up, we were only told about my father's ancestry, which was a Baptist missionary who came in 1840, 1830, that kind of time, which was a more comfortable heritage, So when people would look at me and say, well, you're not Jamaican, right? And I would say, yes, I'm a Jamaican, born here. And how come? My great-grandfather was a Baptist missionary. I run the words together fast like that because I'm saying, not a plantation owner. And here, 2014, discovering the plantation owner. So that kind of took residence in my head. And the third thing was I had an aunt, Aunt Sybil, who she was born in 1896 in Black River, and she lived to 102. And I knew her well. And I used to think about what she had seen in her life, for this 102 years she had lived. She came to Kingston in a buggy. And towards the end of her life, I remember showing her a computer. And so all of this kind of came together in my head, and I started to think about the woman under the stairs, this ancestry, and what would a woman who lived for a big chunk of the 20th century, what would she have seen, and how would that work out? The last thing, I forgot the fourth, I can't count. The last thing was I heard that near to where I'd been at that workshop, a man, a foreigner, had taken the stones of a plantation ruin to build his own house. And I thought, what if it wasn't a man? What if it wasn't a foreign man? What if it wasn't a white man? What if it was a Black rural woman? So that's a long answer, but it was a long process.
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating answer. I think what was compelling too was the realization, which I didn't realize the first time I read it, that you were using your actual ancestors, that you incorporated the names of your actual ancestors and slaveholding ancestors as well. And I found, I'm really fascinated by DNA and researching my family's connection to slavery. And, during my COVID, my grandfather died and he was from St. Elizabeth. And so I kind of went on this rabbit hole to kind of research his family and kind of understand what was true about what he told us about his family and what was a myth. And one of the things, and my great aunts are still alive and they still believe this, was that, they weren't from Jamaica, that they've never met their grandparents because they were from Scotland. And I've been in Facebook groups where these kind of myths kind of are passed around. And basically it just felt like the story was conceived so that, they wouldn't have to have a connection to slavery at all. They came from abroad, they have, their hands are clean. So I guess I was just wondering, what made you want to incorporate your family? What made you want to put it at the forefront of the novel?
Because I thought it was such a universal story of Caribbean people. I didn't want to step back from it. People often ask, well, how did you feel about discovering this background? And I'll say, I didn't have feelings of guilt, because I feel like guilt is something personal, something you did, But I did have these feelings of sorrow and regret that any of this happened. But also at bottom, I'm a storyteller. So this just seemed to me the most richest material to mine. And all of my books, I have used contemporary events or real people that happen to kind of illustrate the fictional part. So I guess it was a natural thing for me to interpose my own ancestors. And it was long enough ago they can't sue,
Yeah.
So.
There are a lot of revelations that the main character has in the novel, and I don't want to give them away. But one thing I was thinking while I was reading is that often we as Jamaicans don't know ourselves. And I think the main character goes through most of the novel thinking that she does, and realizes that the connections she had in her mind are not the real connections in her real life. And I was wondering why. And obviously part of that is slavery, but it seems a little more complex. I noticed that, last time I went to Jamaica, I have a brother who works at the University of West Indies. And so I spent the day with him, and we just kept walking past the ruins of the plantation. And I just asked him questions, what is this? What's the story? And he was like, oh, I don't even notice it. You know what I mean? And I just wonder if it's just so entrenched in our lives, that in everyday Jamaicans' lives, that you don't even think about it anymore, or it's an intentional burial, that past.
I think it's contested at home. Yes, certainly you walk past the ruins at the University of the West Indies and you probably stopped, 10, 50 students and asked them if they knew the history of that area. They probably would not. But at the same time, there's still this burden, this legacy that colors our current politics. We have the leader of the opposition is a white man of English extraction. His father came to, so he doesn't have a slavery background, but his father came to Jamaica and he was born there as a 2-year-old, or came as a 2-year-old. And it's often said, white man can't run Jamaica because of slavery. So I don't think it's passed at all. And we have a very mixed view about the relics of slavery, which is another thing that interests me. I kind of don't want them burnt to the ground, which some Jamaicans will tell you. I also don't want them to be places where you go to have a wedding and there's a mento band with a drink and all of that, right? But what do we do with these monuments of our history? I find myself wanting them to be kept and to be places of mourning and remembrance and acknowledgement of this past. I think we need to talk about it more than we do,
Yeah, I think one of the, last time I was there, I also went to the National Library to do research. And I'm a librarian and I'm an archivist. So one of the things that struck me and made me a little sad was some of the deterioration, I guess, of a lot of the materials. And I think it's even mentioned in your book at some point, that so many Jamaicans turn away and aren't looking back to preserve and contribute and help after we've kind of dispersed abroad. And I think a big theme in your book is kind of holding the land as sacred. And I wondered, how has your work as an environmental activist kind of influenced this book?
So I spent almost 30 years as an environmental activist, and for me, I'm obsessed with connection to place, rootedness, who feels it, what does it mean, is it important? So, and I have always just loved Jamaica, the place, and became an environmentalist because it seemed to me we were treating it very badly. So, but if you're a displaced people, if your origins are displaced and enslaved people, and we still have huge problems with land tenure. Most Jamaicans are landless, and we call them squatters, informal settlers. Very high percentage of our people are in that category. I've often asked myself, and I think I say something like this in here, that so if you are dispossessed from land, how can you value it? You have no rights to it more than any rat, bat, worm, cockroach kind of thing. So how do you feel these feelings of connection that I felt coming from a different kind of background? And I think it's nothing more complicated really than a great love for the place that I was born. Always an outdoor person, so love the land and want to see us recognize it and look after it, but don't want my books to be, now listen people, there's an environmental problem, pay attention. So, but I sort of try and hide in the book my love for the land and hope a reader will feel it.
Yeah, and I really felt that in this book. One thing that I wondered about too is I know you grew up in Jamaica. You're from Kingston specifically, yes. But the book takes place in St. Mary and Mason Hall. So did you have to kind of physically go there, do research, spend time there to kind of paint this place in literature, or are you able to kind of write about a place without going there?
I don't know about have to, but I did. Mason Hall was, when I heard this for the first time, was not a place I knew. And because of my environmental work, I would tell you I really knew Jamaica very well. So that was a bit of a shock as well, And so I had to go there. But my family, the way I was fortunate to grow up was we went to, country a lot, Some members of my father's family were from country. So I had a lot of exposure to the island. But yes, I went to Mason Hall. As it turned out, I knew somebody who was born there, which I did not know. He did not know, but in chatting, Danny, where are you from? Mason Hall. You kidding me? And he was kind enough to show us around and introduce us to people and talk about what they knew about and it's very, it's really close to GoldenEye on the North Coast, where the James Bond books were written. And it's just amazing that it's a little tourist place very close by, and then there's this rural Jamaican village, which is still very much a rural Jamaican village. I had to go there and smell it and feel it, and what could I see and not see from where the village was.
And was there, when you talked to people, was there this kind of oral history still preserved about your ancestors?
Only one man who came up. Towards the end of the time we spent there, one man came up and he said, yeah, man, there was a background master here and him plantation over there. So you can't reach it, don't miss. You see, all like you can't get there. But come back in the right clothes and I'll take you. Okay, so he was the only one who really knew of any kind of slavery connection.
And, I also read that Miss Pauline, the voice, kind of came to you during the pandemic. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that.
So I would say her voice was totally resident in the head before the pandemic. But in lockdown, my fifth book had come out more or less in COVID, so it had a rough road. And I felt like I was done with publishing. I'd written all my life, but the whole publication journey just felt like I was done. So we were at home, lockdown, but I decided I was going to write for myself. And I was going to let this woman who had been in my head since 2003 out onto the page. And there was going to be no censor in my own head. There was going to be no plot. I don't like plotting. I like lots of narrative. I would bore you to death with descriptions, and that was going to be fine. And I called it my long strip of knitting. I'd say to my husband, I'm going off to knit. And I never intended to send it anywhere. And then Justine Hensel, who is a producer for Calabash, those of you who are literary may know of that festival in Jamaica. And she sent me this opportunity. I was unagented for all my other books. She sent me this opportunity to apply for writers over 50. Well, I was plenty past 50. But I sent the first 5,000 words, and then they asked for 10,000. And when I sent the 10,000, it won. And then I had to write the book, and I had to put in a plot, and I had to, stop all the narration and the description of the worms and whatever else, and make it into a book. And that's how it happened.
Yeah, one of the things I admired was how fluid the narration felt. You don't use punctuation to differentiate dialogue, and it feels as if Miss Pauline's voice is just and the narrator are just connected, and they flow into each other really well. So I wondered if that was hard to do, and yeah, if you first wrote the book in first person and kind of decided to switch to...
It was all over the place. Okay. It was all over the place. But one of the things I did consciously do was, how we code switch in the language? Yeah. So we can talk in standard English like I'm talking to you now, and then let's say you annoy me, and in my head I'm going to say something, but I'm going to say it in patois, right? And I wanted to do that. I wanted to show the fluidity of the language that exists in one person, and the fluidity of the way we communicate with each other, and how the way we communicate sort of says something about our class and our educational background. So that was more consciously done, which is why I decided about the no punctuation thing.
Yeah, I think the patois is very beautiful in here, and I like that Melanie used the phrase nation language.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's how it felt.
We call it Jamaican at home now. We don't really say patois.
Yeah. So I think that's one thing I was wondering too. I think it's something that some writers struggle with, because I feel like now Caribbean literature is, being sent to a wider audience. Do you feel like kind of this negotiation with writing for Jamaican people, writing for people outside of Jamaica when you're writing the language?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, it does come up because Jamaican is not a written language. So you are faced with the problem of rendering how we speak, on the page. And there's a lot of different spellings people use. Do you write you as Y-O-U, or we say you? Do you write it Y-U-H? All of that, right? So what I try to do with all my books is to do some justice to the rhythm of the language without making it too difficult for a non-Jamaican reader, and to use some Jamaican language, some Jamaican words that perhaps a non-Jamaican won't understand or might understand from the context, but is not very sure. And that's the kind of negotiation that happens with an editor. They'll in this case, they would ask, what is this whisk that you're talking about, or what is a peeny wally? And there'd be this kind of back and forth about, okay, are we going to explain? What are we going to put in italics and not put in italics? What do we think a reader will get? Does it matter if they don't fully get? Yeah. So there was that kind of negotiation. And I hope we found a good balance between showing the beauty and the lilt of Jamaican language without making it too inaccessible.
And you said that the voice came to you first. Is that how the writing process is for you always? With the other books, the voice comes first? And
my characters have come first in all cases. And sometimes I have no idea, that in the case of one of them, a kid moved into my head, and he was sitting on this edge of Kingston Harbor looking for his grandfather. And I had no idea what happened to the grandfather or what was going to happen to the kid or the grandfather. But somehow Anthony Winkler used to say, trust the darkness. He was one of our Jamaican writers who wrote hilarious books. And he told me, trust the darkness. And so I kind of learned, it didn't happen immediately, but I kind of learned to let these people in my head out and see what they had to say. And not all of them have made it anywhere, Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought because of your, your background as an environmentalist, the place would come first.
No.
Oh no, but
No.
it's always characters.
But then, but they're always in a place somehow, you know? I did not, back in 2003, I did not know this woman who was in my head from under the front steps of the plantation Great House had anything to do with St. Mary. So it's usually the people, but sometimes they're in a place. The boy was sitting at the edge of Kingston Harbor. It was going to be about the sea. Another boy was in Kingston. It was going to be urban. So, yeah.
One of the things I was going to ask was about, I feel like Caribbean literature, the market has changed so much, and the experience of publishing Caribbean literature has changed so much. I didn't realize you started publishing after 2010, though, because you've written so many books, so you're very productive, obviously. But, in that time frame, like, how has it changed for you? Do you feel like we're reaching a wider audience?
I think that definitely. I think the Caribbean literature is enjoying a kind of, I don't know if it's a second or a third wave, but a renaissance, really, and a lot of interest. And we've had some extremely successful Caribbean writers. I would say I'm in a little bit of a different position to many because I still live there. And I think that's very hard. It's hard in today's publishing environment to promote a book from if you still live in the Caribbean. So that's a major challenge I have found. Of course, you know that in the when you first start to send out your book, there's a lot of rejection that comes back to you, and you have to just plug through that. But I've been really happy to see the growth of things like Calabash, the Bocas Lit Fest in Trinidad, and the success that many Caribbean writers have had. So I'm hoping we're riding a wave.
You've already mentioned a couple of writers, but I'm curious, like, who kind of inspired and mentored you as you started writing?
So I think those are two different things, really. Inspired me, the first Caribbean writer I read, it was a set book in school that made me think, because I wanted to write when I was very young. I declared at 13 I was going to write. I was going to be a writer. That was sort of tolerated for a while until you need to get a job, and then, no, that's not how you're going to do things. But the first person I read that I remember thinking, I could maybe do this was Olive Senior's Summer Lightning, which was, I think, an O-level set book.
That was one of the earliest Caribbean books I read.
Yeah. And I mean, it's short stories, but I think they're genius short stories. So that was something that made me think I could write. Earl Lovelace, also, The Dragon Can't Dance.
One of my favorite books.
Yeah, that made me think maybe I could do something like that. And then much later, when Jamaican writers started to have some success, Marlon James, Kai Miller, Monique Roffey, whose White Woman on a Green Bicycle really made me think, okay, no, I could definitely do that. Mentoring, I would say the person who most held my hand through all of this she's a writer, she's a linguist, she's an activist, is Esther Figueroa, who, her father was a very senior academic and writer. And I think she really held my hand through a lot of the ups and downs of it. Monique Roffey has been very supportive, Leonie Ross also. So you, for being here. So, and I don't like that question just because you're sure to forget somebody, but those are the ones that come to mind, yeah.
And, you recently won the BCLF short fiction contest, which was such a beautiful story, Picking Crabs in Negril, which was published in the Brooklyn Rail. I'm just wondering, how is the experience of writing a short story for you versus a novel? Is the way you approach them a little similar, or?
Well, I think they're similar, but the short stories kind of come to an end. But many, many of my short stories have made it into books. So when I look back at them, I think, there's a novel here. So my first book, Dog Heart, was first a short story called Car Park Boy, which was published by the Caribbean writer. Gone to Drift, The Boy by the Kingston Harbor, was first a story called The Dolphin Catchers, which won the Caribbean Regional Prize for the Commonwealth Writers Short Story Prize. So a lot of my books started as short stories. And when you come to the end of the short story, for me, there's a feeling of, I'm not ready to let this go yet. These people are still with me, they have more to say, it's not resolved. And I find myself going back to it, and then over a period, of course, it's a much, much longer road. If it's a novel, I find myself going back to them. But I don't think I approach a piece of writing thinking, I'm going to write a short story, or this is the first page of a novel. It's more something has taken hold of me, and I want to get it out, and I get it out and see where it goes.
I'm just inspired by how much you've written, because it was so hard for me to write the second book. And I think I mentioned upstairs that, I wrote a pandemic novel and I decided to put it aside. And, then I wrote another novel, and that's the novel that'll be published next. But, what makes you, like, have you had novels that you've had to put aside, or do you just kind of plow through and finish everything? Like, how do you keep going?
I have a stack, probably this big, of the book, of stuff that's never seen the light of day. So there's a lot of things I've started writing that I've never finished. And I think that's, often if people ask you about your writing journey, that's something that you have to sort of say, it's really easy not to finish things. And anything you're working on, you're going to lose faith with it at some point. But there are some things that just never gel, that never come together, I have a book length, 80,000 word environmental memoir that has never seen the light of day. So, yeah, I'm always writing, and not all of it makes something that's publishable or even finished.
And how do you know the difference? Like, I mean, because obviously as writers, sometimes we're beholden to like deadlines, and you kind of have to finish whether you want to or not. But how do you decide like what you're gonna like do the work for and keep going on?
Yeah, this book is the only one that had a deadline. Everything else was written before, and it was then being shopped, and people either liked it or didn't like it. For me, I always, by the time I finish a book length work, I'm completely sick of it, and I think it's rubbish, and no one should ever bore themselves with it. And I put it down. I call it cooking. Other people have called it cooking. I put it aside and I go and do something different. And then I come back to it to decide whether it is going to go into the trunk, or am I going to really try and send it out. And I often find after the period of time that when you come back to it, you say, well, yeah, there's some shaky bits that perhaps I could work on, but there's a kernel, there's a something here that is worth the work. Sometimes when you read it, you think, no, really, we should just put this one in the trunk. So, but who knows whether someone else would have a different view? That's another thing you learn, I'm sure, because you send out your stuff. The first person says your main character is not believable, so no. And then the second person says, boy, I loved your main character, but the plot is weak. So you get these lots of conflicting things from people, and somehow you have to really ask yourself, what is it I want to say here? And have I managed to say it? And if the answer to that is yes, then have some faith and take the rejections when they come and just keep going. Yeah.
I just want to go back. I'm really fascinated by the environmental memoir, and I hope you publish it. But how can you talk? I know it's connected to this book, I think, because the themes are there. But how how did you become an environmentalist? Like, what spurred you?
So I went to a beach that my parents and grandparents took me. It's a Palisades strip in Kingston, which if anybody's ever flown into Kingston has driven along. And it was a beautiful place to go and watch the sunset. And I went to see it. I had a house guest. And what do you do with a house guest in Kingston? So I was driving him around. I took him there to watch the sunset. And when we drove up onto the beach, it had become a garbage dump. And I don't mean litter. I mean truckloads of garbage. And I was ashamed. This guy was there, and he was like, obviously, why has this woman brought me here? And I felt personally offended by it. And I remember standing on that beach and sort of looking out at the sea and thinking somebody should do something. And back then, there was really no talk about the environment in Jamaican newspapers, but there was a foreigner, a Costa Rican man who was there on secondment from the Pan American Health Organization, who wrote about Kingston Harbor being polluted. I went to see him. I just pitched up at his office and said, look, I want to know about this. Can you take me in the field the next time you're going? And he took me to places I, as a lifelong Kingstonian, had never been to, never even thought about, 3 sewage plants for Kingston, none of which worked, and the Riverton City dump. And I stood on the beach, different beach, where the sewage plant at Harbour View flowed over the beach into the sea. And that same thought, somebody should do something, came into my head. And I just thought, well, who? It should be you. I didn't know anything about the environment, but I'm a reader, so I started to read and eventually left my job, and that took me over.
You know, I think that kind of relates. I think this book talks a lot about, you know, how land is a commodity, obviously. You know, and I think with the kind of like immigration, tourism, all these things, sometimes the land falls into the hands of people who have no real stake in it.
Sure.
And that was something that resonated to me, especially like rural land. You know, my family on my father's side is from Frankfield in Clarendon. And I've been offered land because it passed, you know, land that nobody's, you know, had to claim, but somebody has to pay the taxes, and it becomes so transactional. But, you know, I didn't take it because I realized, you know, I have no stake in that land. I didn't grow up there. But I think it just kind of made me think about what we can do to kind of like preserve family land and preserve cultural identity.
I think we have to get away from this idea of ownership and more stewardship. I often say people should have to take a test before they can own land, you know. So because we do have this idea of ownership, and you know, you'll hear it at home, you know, tree them on my land, I can chop them down if I want, right? So I think we have to build a better set of values for the land, what it gives us, and what it really means, yeah?
And what did you want people to take away from this book, first and
Whoa.
foremost?
You know, my main character in this book is, I hope people think she's an example. A strong Jamaican woman who overcame, you know, I never lived her life, who overcame these incredible hurdles and lived life on her own terms, you know, at a period of time when she would never have heard the word feminism or anything. So I guess, first of all, I want people to take from it the lives of women and some of the things that they have to deal with and still have to deal with here. I want people to think about this whole conquest idea of land and the erasure of whole sets of people and civilizations, and what do we do with the remnants of those acts in building nationhood or, you know, relationships with each other. And also to look more deeply into our own histories and understand that if you're a Caribbean person, you are both slave owner and enslaved. You are both those things. And which bit of your genetics are you going to really hate? So I want us to really understand the complexity of what we have inherited. And actually celebrate it in a way. Because, you know, in writing this book and in doing the reading I did to support it, it struck me that it is, what happened in the Caribbean is the story of humanity. We've always had this go out. Some people had no choice. They were kidnapped, they were captured, they were, you know, tortured, killed. Other people did it for better economic reasons, or just adventuring. And then they settled somewhere else. And they had their impacts in that place. And it's a human story. And it has its consequences, but it also has its diversity, its celebration, its survival. I mean, to use a word I hate, resilience. Yeah, it's very interesting. So I want us to think about that. And despite how we all got to be in Jamaica, or anywhere in the Caribbean, or anywhere, there we are. You know, I read quite a bit when I was writing this about the way Native Americans tell stories, and they don't start with the English, once upon a time. They start with, it happened in this very place. And I think that's really the thing that we need to honor the land. You know, this place is called Man Bump because when my great aunt was coming from Black River to Kingston in a buggy, she looked up at that enormous mountain and thought, boy, I wonder if the horse them going to make it up there, you know. So yeah, it happened in this very place.
That's such a beautiful message. I feel like I don't want to, I want to close on that because it's so beautiful. I think now is a good time to open it up to audience questions. Does anybody have a question? She's going to bring the microphone.
So my first question was, how was it negotiating the preservation of language in this book? Because I read the first couple of chapters, we really preserved patois, and it's a living language that's constantly evolved. So how was that for you in the publishing process?
I think the microphone wasn't on, so I'm just going to repeat her question. So how was it preserving language in this book was your question, right?
Well, I mean, I born in Jamaica, lived there all my life. The Jamaican language is in my head. So the task for me really was just how to get it on the page. And it is a question about how well you do that. And there will be people who will look at this book and take issue with some of the ways I've rendered the Jamaican language. Yeah? I'm expecting that. And there will be debates about it. But I could only take the way it rings in my head and what I hear as I go about my daily life and try to do justice to it in a written language, because it is not a written language. And the other thing I'd say is somebody my age has seen the Jamaican language really evolve. It has changed from when I was a teenager. And one of the biggest challenges in this book for me was writing in the voice of Lamont, the boy that eventually helps Miss Pauline to navigate the mysteries of the internet, because he's a modern Jamaican youth. And I wasn't really sure that I could do justice to the speech of a modern Jamaican youth. So you have to do a bit of research. You have to talk to people. You have to ask them to read the bits for you and tell you what they think. And hopefully I got good advice.
Thank you for that question. I think there's a question in the back.
Thank you. This has been really interesting. I'm curious. I feel like with any diasporic community, there are almost like three areas. There are people who are from whatever place and still live there. There are people who are maybe like a generation removed, maybe like the child. And there are people who have a different experience of the place, probably like as a tourist. And they all feel very committed to their understandings of a place. And so in the same way you're talking about this idea of ownership of a place, it almost also feels like ownership of a narrative. And I'm curious, as someone who is Jamaican and still living in Jamaica, do you feel like you're writing for a particular audience? Or do you think about the different groups that receive your work and how they receive it when you're writing?
I try not to think about audience, because if you start to think about the book that you're writing, the first 10 words, how that's going to be received, you won't get to word number 12. So I try not to think about audience when I'm writing it. I will say that your books tend to be received differently at home than they do in diasporic audiences. My first book, which is very urban, set in Kingston, kind of crime-ridden, kind of a bit harrowing, I think. I read up here in New York to quite a few audiences, and a lot of older Jamaicans showed up. And they really took me on, because they were like, no, that's not the Kingston I left, that's not the Jamaica I left. So they had a very nostalgic view of the lives that they had left. So I think our books are received differently, depending on whether people live at home or have left, or what age they are, and the memories that they carry, and whether they regard. For me, there's two sets of people: the people who leave Jamaica or any Caribbean island, and they want to hear all the bad news, right? Because they want to know they did the right thing and the place has just gone to hell and all of that, right? And then there are people who can't stop looking back, and and they're very conflicted. So sometimes at these readings over the urban book, people would catch up, because but you have to, I think, as a writer, let that the way your book is going to be responded to, you have to let that go and let it find whatever audience it does resonate with. It's not going to be everybody.
I have one quick question. You mentioned being both slave owner and enslaved. And I'm curious to know how you suggest we reconcile those things, not just as writers, but as humans from the Caribbean.
I'm not sure I think they're reconcilable. I mean, like I say, I did not really feel guilt learning of this history because you don't choose who your ancestors are. But I think if we all recognize, I mean, certainly somebody like me, I had a head start in life, right? Partly due to this ancestry. Although if I had another very long time to sit here, I'd tell you a lot of the bumps in the road of my ancestors. So it wasn't all, we got riches and we're all fine. But obviously my light skin in a place like Jamaica gave me a head start in the beginning. And I think the responsibility that somebody like me has is to really try and understand the different perspectives of people that didn't have that kind of head start. And in my own social circles, I'm something of a pariah, because to a very large degree, people don't want to talk about these things. They're like, Diana, the man slavery done 300 years ago. Why we keep going back to the whole thing? But I feel we need to start listening and need to understand the very different places people start from.
There were 2 questions down front as well, right? I think pariah is such a good word because I felt that too when I started wanting to talk.
And environmentalist as well, telling all the hotel owners and kind of all of that stuff. No, man.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful conversation. I have to say, I listened to a preview of the book on the Brooklyn Caribbean Lit Fest and their Cocoa Pod last week, and Miss Pauline sounded really familiar. And just listening to patois, I call it my rule-governed language because I love it so much. But I want to refer back to when you said how difficult it is to publish works from Jamaica. I think about myself as a kid growing up in rural Jamaica, how wonderful it would have been to read more books like A House for Miss Pauline, that highlighted patois, not as a side piece, but as the main character, the rule-governed language with the kind of respect that it deserves. And I wonder how we can make stories like A House for Miss Pauline more accessible, especially in the rural parts of Jamaica.
Yeah, good question. I think it's changing. When I went to school, we certainly, apart from Olive Senior, we certainly got no Caribbean literature. And a little bit of Caribbean history, but mostly it was the Tudors, British history. I do think that it's changing now, and there is quite a strong push for recognition of Jamaican as our first language. Of course, there's also a resistance to that. I think something that dogs our education system, which is, if I was at home, this is going to get me into a lot of trouble, is the resistance of our teachers to teach new stuff. So they're teaching kind of the same things that 10, 15, 20 years ago were the set books, and we're still teaching them. So I think the system needs to be shaken up, and people need to, grapple with some of the new works of Caribbean fiction. I mean, one of the problems is a bad word problem, because you can't get a book into the Jamaican school if it have any bad word in them.
Yes, I was thinking about
so,
that too.
I mean, that whole Amal James out, So that's one of the. So
that's why we're still reading Old Story Time and Smile Orange.
You got it. So that's one of the things that I think that we have to really come. What my grandmother would have called a 40-shilling word, because that was a fine for using them. We're still very conflicted about that, but I do have some hope that it is changing. And now, if you're at home and there's a newsreader reading the news, she will read in standard English, but the reporters who are interviewing the people who are concerned, they're all speaking in Jamaican. So you can get lost if your Jamaican is not so great. And that's changed in my life.
There's one question down front and one in the back.
Thank you for this talk. You mentioned earlier that there's a difference with promoting the book when you are still a resident in Kingston. Why do you think that is? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Just a geography. So writers are mostly introverts. You know, you see me here sitting up like I'm comfortable talking to you. You know? So we're people who live in our heads, and we're introverts, and we don't really want to go up to people and say, my book is great, please buy it, right? So that's a kind of background. But these days, books mostly don't have publicity budgets, right? So how do you get any attention for your book? Social media has made it easier. When my first book came out, there was no social media. Social media has made it easier because anybody can kind of come to grips with that. But how do you get word about your book out? It's in small ways. You go to the local library and you read there. You know, you show up at a bookshop and say, can I interest you in carrying this book? Can I sign it for you? And when your book is being published in outside of your country, there's an ocean, a flight between you. It's expensive, you know. So it's hard to get attention outside of your own country. I mean, I can call up the Tom Redcam Library and say, you know, I'd like to come and read from my book, and they'll say, oh, fabulous, what about Thursday? But the whole different situation up here, and the cost of books. I mean, my delightful son, who was the only reason why I have arrived here today and not got lost forever, he went to buy my book. He said to me, what a way it's expensive, right? Which I can assure you would be the reaction at home, right? Everybody would think, are you kidding me? No, man, nobody going to pay that for a book. So, you know, reading is a luxury at home, unfortunately. I've seen in my time since 2010, so many bookshops fail at home. So that kind of culture that existed where you could go to a local bookshop is very much less now. So that's why you're just far away. It's not that expensive, though. You should still buy it. You see, he could promote a book.
We have time for one more question.
I was really inspired to hear both of you talk about researching your ancestry. And as a Jamaican transplant to America, I have been very intrigued to see how African Americans are recovering their ancestral history. But it feels like here they have more access to their history. Like if I was going to go to Jamaica, I wouldn't know where to start looking for my ancestors' history. I remember asking my mother about ancestors, and she said, well, you know, only God knew they lived. And that's all she had to really say about that. So how did you guys, you know, begin the journeys of exploring your ancestries within Jamaica? I'd love to know more.
You want to start?
You know, I'm a librarian, so I have a lot of access to databases. I think, you know, sometimes, you know, my family would tell these stories that were really ridiculous. But I feel like even in a ridiculous story, there's some truth there. You know, and I would kind of try to figure out, I think there's a lot of, you know, there's always a story underneath the story. And I think I would hear some of the stories that my grandfather would tell, like that his grandparents were Scottish, that they had never, you know, they just lived in Jamaica for a time and they moved back to Scotland. You know, and you know, in the end, he was descendant from somebody who was, but it was 5 generations ago. You know, and I think, you know, I think just talking to my mother and hearing what she knew and talking to other families, and then I would go to the databases. FamilySearch.org is a really great database. It's a free database. And they have a lot of Jamaican records, actually, dating back pretty far. that are online and available for free. Ancestry too, but Ancestry sometimes charges you for the stuff that Family Search has for free. You can also, I think you don't even need a subscription, but you can also look at, both things informed each other. So once I was able to find baptismal records on Family Search, I was able to go to Ancestry and look at other people's family trees, get names, and then you can also look at slave registries, which were very helpful. I think the assumption is that sometimes because people were baptized, they were free. And what I realized is a lot of times they were slaves, and that's how I, kind of traced the slave lineage of my family, which my family didn't my mother's family didn't want to admit to. So I think it's just, it's a combination oral history, just piecing together the names. Even with just the last name, my great grandmother's name was Penny Cook. So I literally looked at every single Penny Cook from St. Elizabeth until I could find any familiar names, looking at who signed the birth certificate, who signed the death certificate, who signed, other records, and seeing if, anybody had known these people. And what I found was that, actually my great-grandmother, my great-grandaunt, who's still alive, had signed a bunch of records, and that's how I, found my great-great-grandmother, my great-great-grandfather, and things like that. So it's like a slow, laborious process, but you don't really have to go there. When I went to Jamaica to do research, that was later in the process when I had even more names. I wanted to research my sixth great-grandfather. That's why I went to the National Library. But a lot of it is just going through tons of birth certificates, death certificates, baptismal records that are available online.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. A lot of it is online, no? Some of the research for my story was done by some of my distant cousins through the Registrar General in Kingston. We, again, myself and my son, we never had any luck with that source, but there are these online databases, some free, some not free, that you can go, and once you have some names, and everything leads you to some other thing. When you look at a baptismal certificate, it's not just the name of the child who is there and the parents, but there's somebody else, a doctor who is there, a relative who is there, wills, you can get a lot of wills, but it is a very slow and painstaking process.
All right, I think that was our last question. Thank you so much, Diana. This was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
So guys, if you're leaving here tonight and you don't have questions in your head about this conversation, you might have to come back and have a do-over. But this was very fantastic. I have thoughts in my head. I'm going home to think, but I want to thank Diana and I want to thank Maisy. And I literally want to take this moment to give Diana her flowers. I want to say congratulations, Diana, on behalf of the BCLF. This is a monumental moment for you, and all right, well, I got them today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Please buy a book and get them signed. And don't just buy a book for yourself. Buy a book for a friend, a family member. Signing will be on the other side of this wall. So just give us about 5 minutes to get Diana set up, and then you can all come out. But thank you all for coming.